Right, our next session is going to be a fishbowl discussion or a panel discussion, and we've got a number of different people that are part of the panel and that will be joining us. Our panel discussion is, as I said, going to be on reforming scholarly communication and the role of librarians. And our panel includes researchers, publishers, and librarians. Some are going to be online and other people are with us here in the room. So the first person that I'm going to introduce is Professor Geoffrey Boulton. He's going to be online, and he is Regius Professor of Geology and Emeritus Professor at the University of Edinburgh. And then Prof. Ahmed Bauer is Professor of Higher Education at the Johannesburg Business School and has recently completed his term as CEO of Universities of South Africa. Then Dr. Salvo Haleta, whom we've just heard, is joining us online. And then Andrew Joseph is a digital publisher at the University of the Witwatersrand Press. And then I think she's on this side. Malavika Legi is the program manager at OASPA and is very passionate about publishing and open access. And then we have representing us as librarians, Dr. Daisy Silamat, sorry, Daisy. No. Dr. Daisy Silematsela, and she is the executive director at WITS Library and the chair of CHELSA and a board member of SANLIC. So we are going to begin with a short presentation by Professor Geoffrey Boulton, and then we are going to give each of the panel members an opportunity to respond to that presentation and to give their own ideas about reforming scholarly communication. And then we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience, both online and those of you that are present here. When we get to the questions, I'd like to ask that you please raise your hands so that we can send the mic to you, because you need to speak into the mic so that the people online can hear. And for those of you that are joining us online, you are welcome to either speak or to put your questions in the chat, and the questions will come up on the screen, and so we can all see your questions and the panelists can respond to them. So over to you, Prof. Geoffrey. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Well, firstly, I'm sorry not to be there. I wish I were, but circumstances have prevailed against that. Adam Pantanovich this morning gave an inspiring introductory talk, which posed two obvious questions of this meeting. If, as he suggested, fast access to information is a crucial public good, why have we created the complex, inefficient, and costly bridge of modern scientific publishing between scientific results on the one hand and their public dissemination on the other? And how has the commercial publishing industry found ways of disabling Moore's law? As we've heard, libraries are working very hard to adapt to new and complicated transformative agreements to perform this bridging task. But it's clear to many of us that we must go further if we're to support the research effort as it needs to be supported. I speak as a scientist who uses the word science to describe almost everything we teach at university. And I'm a scientist who not only loves librarians, but has had the responsibility for a library system. But when we speak of the role of university libraries, we should be very clear about what our library systems must be designed to support. Science is concerned with the same phenomena that have taxed the human imagination from the earliest times and in all societies, but it's pursued in a way that makes science a special form of knowledge. This lies in the way that knowledge claims and the evidence on which they're based are made widely available and formally tested against reality and logic through the processes of sustained and organized scrutiny by peers. This places very particular and peculiar responsibilities on scientific libraries and librarians. Can we have this first slide, please? Thanks. This scientific process is currently vitally important to humanity for two basic reasons. Firstly, it helps us individually and collectively to navigate the complicated, crowded, and demanding world we inhabit. And secondly, it's essential to the Sustainable Development Goals, which provide a blueprint for humanity's collective commitment to the global public good. However, those two objectives are best served by a third priority, that of creating a global scientific community and making it a reality. The possibility and probability of that happening has been immensely enhanced by the digital revolution of recent decades, which has put unprecedented tools of communication and analysis in our hands. And it's up to us to ensure that these are used as effectively as possible. The first two of these objectives are social and political priorities, for which science is a fundamental lever. And here we see poor old Archimedes 2,000 years ago with his famous statement, "Give me a lever and a place to stand, and I will move the earth." If we can follow Archimedes' example by using digitally enhanced science as a lever, it immensely increases the possibility of achieving our social and political objectives, but only if we find the right place to put that lever. In other words, the social and political interfaces of science are crucial, something that's been stressed by Dr. Petanovich. The power of science is leveraged by a global community, the scientists and the librarians that create and preserve the record of science. They preserve it for all. The record of science is the record of published scientific discovery and speculation since the earliest times. The fundamental question implicit in this meeting is how to make that record as efficiently and effectively available as possible. That always has been and will continue to be the central question for libraries as technologies and needs change. Next slide, please. The International Science Council's global membership of academies and international unions and associations of science, with the NRF in South Africa being the national member, has endorsed 8 vital principles for scientific publishing, designed to ensure the integrity of the record of science and, crucially, its accessibility for all who may wish to use it. These are the first 4, and I draw your attention to 2 of those. The first one, that there should be universal, prompt, open access to the record of science, both for authors and readers, with no barriers to participation, in particular those based on an ability to pay, institutional privilege, or geography or language. Indeed, in the modern day, there's no reason why English should be the language of publication. And number 4, that data and observations on which a published truth claim is based must be concurrently accessible to scrutiny and be supported by necessary metadata. Otherwise, you're just not doing science. Next slide, please. And here in number 8, that governance of the processes of dissemination of scientific knowledge should be accountable to the scientific community and not to commercial shareholders. None of these 3 are upheld by commercial publishers, and few of the others are. The first principle is fundamental. An international scientific community has developed that has become the preeminent non-religious transnational community in the contemporary world. A crucially important issue. It has the potential to be enormously effective in supporting humanity's response to the great global challenges that I've tried to outline. However, the network of communication by publication that is essential to the success of that community, allowing ideas and information to permeate to its nodes, carrying new ideas and new opportunities, and stimulating inspired responses, is damagingly suboptimal. This network has major constrictions that limit information flow, particularly to and from low and middle income countries and poorly funded institutions. Much of that network is currently designed as a profit-focused commercial operation, which naturally preferences well-funded customers rather than performing the functions set out in our principles. Many scientists in low and middle income countries are unable to access articles carried in expensive, highly cited journals, and as authors, they're often unable to afford journals' article processing charges. A challenge to our community is to reform the current system so that its crippling network inefficiencies are removed. Without this, the vital interchanges between societies at different stages of development, essentially if global sustainability goals are to be achieved, will remain beyond our grasp, with the attendant existential risks for a politically and socially fractured world. The essential processes that have caused this disastrous failure are based on the prioritization of the needs of shareholders, of those of science, in an increasingly, my telephone, sorry, in an increasingly commercialized system of publishing that's causing massive harm to the scientific and educational ecosystem. Journal titles have become a proxy for excellence in research. Publishing in a certain journal, not scientific excellence, has become a basis for advancement. It was reported last week in World University News that an English professor asked how scientific excellence was answered by the titles of the journals I publish in. This market in reputation is not a market in science. It's the basis of the journal business model. It creates enormous structural harm to the independent operation of higher education and research institutions, and it creates predatory publishing. When a company controls both the means of distributing content and system metrics to determine value, we're at risk of outsourcing the major roles that our universities play in the research and education ecosystem. It creates a monopoly. It's not a market. Increasing dissatisfaction with the current state of publishing is reflected in the activities of many scientific and library groups working to change the current system in favor of true open access and open science. The US government is moving on this issue. The European Union's Council of Ministers has been profoundly critical, and both are taking action. The G7 group last week or 2 weeks ago called for fundamental reform. Resignations of entire editorial boards have occurred in response to hikes of fees. And the subtitle of this meeting, Breaking the Mold, adds a voice from Africa for fundamental change. The International Science Council is asking its member academies, its scientific unions and associations, and other major stakeholders in the scientific process to support a process to achieve, firstly, that scientific papers should be free via the World Wide Web on open publication platforms that would charge no fees to any who would wish to access them, that access to the authoring process would be cost-free, and that a series of other key functionalities that the digital revolution could have enabled but have been ignored by commercial interests are implemented, including open data, a reimagining of the peer review process, open evaluation platforms, open discovery rather than producer-directed discoveries, embedding new functionalities that enhance sorting, classification, and multimedia interoperability. For example, it's long been possible for all the relevant work in a prescribed field from yesterday, last year, or last week to be intelligently available on our computer desktops at the flick of a keystrokes. We should embed AI systems to identify invalid data and plagiarism at the output of large language models. We should dispose of many journals as, frankly, an anachronism. And we should, as much as possible, be language independent in our communications. How is this possible, you ask? Where would the money come from? The answer is the currently dominant for-profit publishing system is almost entirely funded from a combination of direct public and university sources. A reformed not-for-profit system will be funded from exactly the same sources, but more efficiently and more effectively. The accounts of commercial publishers show profits of between 20% and 50% on a global income of about $20 billion per year. A not-for-profit system would start, therefore, with an additional $4 to $7 billion per year to spend on a more efficient, more effective, and more equitable system. So money isn't the problem. If not, what is? Can we have the next slide, please?
Prof. Boulton, you've got about 2 minutes left.
I can just not finish that time. Frankly, it's the way that money flows to the dominant commercial publishing system. Scientists are incentivized by proxy metrics of journal excellence to choose particular journals. Scientists are free to choose the journals, even though they're expensive, and they, the scientists that is, don't pay for them. It's called moral hazard by economists, where others pay for your choices, and the tab is ultimately picked up by taxpayers. This gives the big publishers a monopoly, which they use to demand high prices for their goods. The aggregate cost of their big deals soak up all the money, such that there is little funding for new and innovative not-for-profit publishers, which is therefore difficult to develop and to sustain. Breaking the mold of this system and replacing it with something that would serve science better is being developed by the International Science Council and its collaborators. It's shortly to circulate its members and other science stakeholders for their endorsement. Hopefully, those of you here will endorse it. Finally, it's clearly vital that the library community is involved as a pressures for change build-up. Thank you.
So much. Let's give him a round of applause. So we're going to start by giving the panelists all an opportunity to respond, both to Prof. Boulton's talk, but also more generally around the question that we have posed around communication and publishing in the scholarly environment. I'm going to start with you, Prof. Bauer, and then we'll move down. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you, Geoffrey, and thank you to Sanlic for inviting me here today. It's always good to be with friends in this area, which is such a vexed area. So I'd like to just, first of all, just say that it's not possible for me to critique what Geoffrey said because I'm on the task team that he chairs that produced the 8 principles. But what I would like to do, Maria, if you don't mind, is just to pick up some of the points that I think are relevant to us.
Thank you.
The first one is, well, first of all, I mean, I think we all have to accept, that the primary purpose of scholarly publishing is to ensure that the public good of science is kind of fostered and brought to fruition. And I think that has to be the starting point. It's a part of the process of science, and it has to be seen as contributing to that end, if you like. And yet, I think, as Geoffrey has pointed out, the current system is an exclusionary system. It's not an inclusionary system. What it does is it places barriers to access to scientific knowledge, scientific information, and so on. And it does seem to me, at least, that one of the critical issues for us is to begin to design a system that is inclusionary rather than exclusionary. The current system is designed by its business model to be exclusionary. I hope the colleagues in the next room are listening to this. But it does seem to me that we have to pay attention to the idea that this is an exclusionary system by design. It's designed for the maximization of profits, and that's what the result. That's what it results in. And I think that what we have to really focus in on, if you like, is to ensure that that this public good function of scholarly publishing reaches not just the academic community, but also the broader community. Because, as Geoffrey pointed out, the SDGs, or the grand challenges facing humanity, are not just restricted to the academic community. The academic community plays a particular role in that. But those grand challenges have to be taken up at the local level, at the level of NGOs, at the level of communities, and so on. And so that knowledge has to be accessible. The second point I'd like to make is that, one of the things that we have to focus on if we are going to move towards an inclusionary system is the development of a global governance model. And that global governance model of scholarly publishing has to be responsive to the, well, has to be kind of really, what do I want to say? Has to speak to the needs of the scholarly community. And what that means in essence is that we have to move towards a global governance system that again is inclusive, that we are sure that Africa has a voice in that governance system, that voice can speak for the African continent in terms of its needs. And of course, I speak of the African continent as a placeholder for the global South, if you like. And I think that the critical issue for us is for us to understand that there's a special responsibility for us to participate in that global governance system in a way that we are prepared, for. So that's the second point, it seems to me. And it's one that this task team in particular is kind of grappling with. What kind of global governance system do we need? Where is it located? What are the roles of organizations like the International Science Council, the International Association of Universities, and so on? How do we bring those global enterprises to play, if you like, in achieving a governance system that has legitimacy? So that's the second point. The third point I'd like to make is that, what we can't have in the future is, and Geoffrey pointed to this, what we can't have in the future is companies or organizations that have responsibility for distributing scientific material, creating journals and so on for distribution, but also being responsible for the metrics, right, for measuring the research output. That is a disastrous situation that we have. It distorts science in a very direct way. We are seeing this all the time, by the way. A recent article in Science pointed out that there's an estimate of 34% of articles in neuroscience which are fake. 34%. Just imagine that. Here's another example, that just very recently, in fact, it turns out that 2 or 3 journals in the pharmaceuticals industry, kind of that are on Elsevier's kind of databases and so on, are actually paid for by the pharmaceutical industry. Now, what does that mean? So there are a range of very distorting effects that come from this, this kind of integration of these two functions. And of course, if you put that into the mix with the idea that those companies are really optimizing profits rather than contributing to the public good of science, then we see this toxic mix, if you like. Finally, and perhaps the most important one for us, is coming to grips with how to deal with institutional culture. Institutional culture and scholarly culture. This, absolute drive for publish or perish is really distorting the science system in many different ways. And it seems to me, at least, that we have to move towards changing that. And the one kind of discussion that we've been having is to using the metaphor of the lever again, is to work out where we can have that effect. In the South African system, I would say that it's really in the funding system that we have to work, because that's our system is so delicately kind of interwoven, if you like, into responding to where the money is, where the money comes from. So it seems to me, at least, that that's an area that we have to work with the NRF and other funding agencies about this kind of culture change in the area of research. With that, I think I'll stop. I hope that was useful.
Yes, thank you very much. Over to you, Malavika.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. There was a lot to take in there between what we've heard, both from Geoffrey online and from you, Ahmed. I just wonder, thinking on a more practical level, right? Because there's lots to agree with here, surely, but how are we going to incentivize more of the practices that we want to see, right? If you look across the 8 principles, how are we going to identify open practice, incentivize open practices in the areas of access, in the areas of data and data management plans and open scholarship, in more use of persistent identifiers and things like this, right? I think if we think about what can we actually do? That's what I'm getting at, right? How can we actually make a difference? And so I think that's something I'm quite keen to know from panelists, from people in the room, from Geoffrey, you know, if alongside these thoughts, we have any action points or ideas around the hows, right? How do we dismantle the chase for high impact factor titles? Okay, I've heard this saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you can have all the strategies that you want, but what is the culture, right? Because that just gobbles up everything. So, you know, then my how becomes what actually are the steps we can take to change that culture. Okay, and I should put out there, I'm not a librarian, I'm not in the library world, and I feel really honored and privileged to be here. I'm past publisher, I'm now at OASPA, so, you know, that's my context, just so you understand where I come from. And if I say bizarre things, then maybe it makes a bit more sense why I say bizarre things, right? And also picking up on principles 1 and principles 8. Now, definitely all of you have the principles in front of you, right? Maybe not, but I noted down principles 1 and 8, and loosely, I mean, I noted the gist, right? And loosely, they are about making sure everybody can participate. And that's principle 1. And principle 8 is basically about saying, let's look at who's represented in the governance, okay? And I think that those 2 principles really speak to the heart of the equity issue, okay? Now, this afternoon, I'm going to deep dive a little bit into how we make open access a bit more equitable. But really, I think what might be helpful to set out right now, especially in the context of these principles, is that equity really has 2 parts to it, at least as OASPA sees it. And, you know, I'm running OASPA's Equity in OA project. And as I am learning, okay, I think really the shape of equity in OA has 2 parts to it. On the first side, there is the financial aspect, the economic aspect, okay? So what are the financial constructs? What are the economic flows in the way in which we're delivering open access? Okay, and we need more equity in that. So we need to make sure in this transformation, in this transition, we're not building a new paywall to publish while we dissolve the paywall to read. Okay, so that's equity from the financial perspective. We then also have equity from the stakeholder perspective, so from the engagement perspective. So there's pricing and models and finance on one side, there is engagement on the other side, okay? And what I mean by engagement is really how are we making sure that everybody has the opportunity to be a stakeholder with a voice, a stakeholder who has influence, okay? So what I mean is who is invited to edit, who is making selections on content and what gets out there or ranked or what have you. Who is part of that conversation shaping actually how we define quality? Because if we are talking about reforming the scholarly system, then I think part of that conversation is also what constitutes quality. And I think different disciplines take different takes on this. But engagement is important, so we have representation properly on who has influence in those discussions as well, okay? So the 2 parts to equity. And the other point I'd like to make is one about coming back to the house, I think it's important for us also to have in mind, and this is librarians, publishers, the lot really, Scholcoms professionals, okay, all of us, how will we demystify things for researchers? Okay, this is not their world, and nor should it be, because I think, if I may say so, you are rock stars here, right? You heard Adam this morning, okay? You make the Adams. You enable them. The work that we're so privileged that the work that we do creates, okay? No, it's true. And there is not only an Adam, there is an Ahmed, and there is an Angela, and there is, there's a whole spectrum of scholarship and a whole spectrum of scholars, and this work is the business of enabling them, facilitating them, helping them generate ideas. So we need to take the friction out of the system for them. The principles are fine, but let's not make more complications, okay? And my last point, and this is potentially a bit controversial, I don't know, but Geoffrey, you were alluding there to, maybe disposing off a lot of journals and things like that. I do think the independent arbiter role has value, okay? And we can argue a lot about for-profit and not-for-profit, and just to put it out there, I can tell you, not-for-profit entities can be very inefficient. They can be very wasteful. They can be very conservative. Okay, my past background is at a scholarly society, which I'm happy to say I managed to move the dial quite a lot on, and they're on a great transition journey. I feel really happy about that. It's such hard work to get movement there, okay? Not-for-profit, mission-driven organization, okay? On the other side of that, for-profit entities can be very efficient, can operate really well at scale. And if you look at your institutions and how the number of FTEs might have increased at your institution, you understand about scale, and you need the outputs to work at scale as well, okay? So I just throw those out there. Thank you.
Fabulous, thank you very much. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Sanlek, for inviting us and inviting me to speak to you today. Malavika just mentioned rock stars, and I feel like Ed Sheeran coming on after the Rolling Stones. It's all a bit watered down here. A few points that I just wanted to make. I think, I was sort of thinking more about what Geoffrey was saying and about the 8 principles, but there's such a good discussion going on here. Perhaps, so firstly, support of the principles, I think, is implicit. And unlike Ahmed, I am on the publishing group in the ISC, working with Geoffrey. So I'm allowed to contest them and be critical of them. But I'd say for the most part, we've already raised, certain concerns and provided some critical feedback about them. I think the institutional culture idea and the culture of scholarship is a really good starting point for this, for me. So the idea of inter-institutional competition, this notion of rankings, I would tie it together with the metricization, with the over-metricization of it. And I don't include measurement in that. I include specifically those the values ascribed to certain indicators. I think the success and the balancing out of national successes or institutional successes, and that almost aggressive competition, which emerges from that, is unhelpful to publishing. It's unhelpful to scholarship. I'm not sure if it's particularly helpful to the researchers themselves. And tied into this is this notion of control and ownership, which I guess is the second point here. And that's one of the things that we're contesting or that we're discussing. Does this lie in the hands of large commercial interests? Does this lie in the hands of everyone on the other extreme, some shared governance sensibility? And I think that's an issue that I'm speaking as a small university press, I'm speaking on behalf of university presses, publishers in the rest of the world, as it's conveniently known. But there should be more of a coordinated effort for us to control, own, and participate more actively with that goes beyond simply self-aggrandizing, profiteering, or however you want to see it, but also that it could be done more transparently. I think there are any number of technical and technological options that are available to us now. There are governance models that work in it. So I would argue for that. My third point would be that we don't operate, unfortunately, we don't operate on a level playing field. We come into this it's a very, very skewed relationship. So it's, I guess, one of the issues that I have with some of the sense of things like SDGs. There are regional specificities, there are language specificities we need to consider. You'll hear it in my presentation later, where we're working with 5 or 6 presses in the South African university press space. All of us have very, very different needs. All of us have very, very different pressures. Some of us are focused strictly on mission. Some of us are focused on perhaps pursuing some sort of profit in order because it's a commercial entity. And most of us are somewhere in between that. So I think, apart from inclusion, I think inclusion needs to be a bit broader than it is in there. And then the last thing I just wanted to, second to last thing, excuse me, was just talk about books. Lovely things, mostly rectangular, and quite important. And it's great for science. It's really excellent. But poetry is going to have a very, very different influence in the world, and it's going to get out differently. It's not going to be read on a tablet. It's not going to be read in a PDF. It needs to be produced in that way. So just to, very silly way of saying it, but the value of humanities and social sciences and the arts, and the value of books as well, in all their manifestations. The very last point I want to make is, if we are concerned about large commercial organizations, institutions, and the power that they can exert over what we know and what we don't, then I would include big tech in this as well. I think there should be some concern about things being made free. So open is one thing, free is another. And just to paraphrase a really nice economist that I like, John Lancaster, who says that if it's free, if you think it's free, then you're probably the product. I think we need to have a little more control over that part of the world. As little as we understand, I can't claim to understand very much about it myself, but I do know that we need as much significant control over that as we would like to have over commercial interests in science.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andrew. Over to you, Daisy.
Yes, thank you, and morning, colleagues, and morning, Geoffrey. I think from the library perspective, and especially from the information science perspective, it's quite intriguing that when we speak of scholarly communication, we all learn by osmosis. And most of us, and some of you here, are from the old era of library science, information science, and knowledge management. And we transitioned in the process. And in doing that, we also have to look at business intelligence. How do we deal with it? And the expectation, when we talk about scholarly communication, scholarly publishing, the expectations are onto us. And I just want to highlight for the past, since Geoffrey, if you recall this history about the International Science Council, as it was ICSU before, when it started in Senegal, Dakar, in 1999, talking about open access in 1999 in Africa, until the General Assembly in core data in 2006 in Beijing, talking about open access and taking it back to South Africa to say, so it's not a new thing that we are talking about, but the fact is information specialists were put somewhere. Academies of science, they meet, they discuss, The Global Science Council meet and discuss Geoffrey, as you know, but where are information scientists in the process? We come in the end, in the receiving end. When the popo hits the fan, the librarian must do this. Our role expectation, and my colleague and old friend here knows that when it comes to small publishers, I would call small publishers our university presses. Expectations are libraries do something. They need to sustain themselves. How can't we treat them in our own universities as entities that produce knowledge? They are expected to operate as a business. And when us librarians budget, you are told, remember you have an adopted brother, that side, or sister, what are you going to do about them? Then you start now with your budgets, and you have to also do what? Convince our seniors and the researchers why you need so much money for what you are talking about today, scholarly publishing, scholarly communication, and you are told, but justify why you need this tool, and you say, no, I can't justify. It's Prof. Bauer who needs to justify. But the same Prof. Bauer is sitting on the table, the Last Supper table. Why do you give the library so much budget? Okay, Prof. Bauer, you know that story. Why so much budget? Then you're told, but go and cut some. You say, okay, I need to cut where you are saying so much budget. Those e-tools and e-resources. So I want to send it home, Geoffrey, with all the 8 parameters that you highlighted, especially the one on governance and the one on administration. For us, it's key because there are role expectations from the librarians. The first one that's critical is the issues around research evaluation and research measurement and management. Nobody taught us in library school. We learn in forums like this, and we have to go in and do that. We talk about the rating of our research, as you know, but who's expected to be doing that on behalf of our researchers? The other aspect is the issue of we are expected to assume the roles. And I remember we were taught about those things in Lancaster. If you remember the books on Lancaster, around our role as intermediaries between the researchers and the research and the publishing houses. It has never stopped. And now it's even worse in the era of open science. Academics are saying, researchers are saying, it's not my turf, do something. What is this APC? Why do I pay so much? Do something. And you go and say, okay, and why do I have to pay for a table that I published in my article? And you say, but did you read the clauses when you were publishing? But everything comes back to you as librarians. The issue is, for me, we are not put around or placed in that Last Supper table. We're an afterthought. Remember when we looked at the South African open science policy? When did we come to the table? Provide input in the end. And who are the implementers of open science? Open access, open data, in our academic institutions and our research councils, librarians. Who build repositories? Librarians. Who come up with mandates on what do we deposit in our repositories? Librarians. So the other challenge is, how do we ask, and I want to put this to the table, because how do us as librarians and information specialists support our university presses? We know that for scholarly communication, there are expectations from our researchers, and they look at the D-head list, and because they also get incentives. You spoke about incentives. We have huge incentives in the country from our own government, but when we look at university presses, are they considered as part of that incentive? So it's a challenge. And for me, it's political will. And use my word that I like to use, demystify. How do we actually demystify scholarly communication in the Global South? How do we consider the understanding of social justice in the Global South? What's our perspective when we talk about social justice? It's not just transformation as we understand it. How do we deal with minorities? And when I say minorities, I'm referring this again to scholarly communication and scholarly publishing, minorities are our African authors. They are minorities in the landscape. How are they perceived? And we have had that. The language issue that Mr. Joseph Andrew highlighted here, it's also a challenge. How do we deal with that in our own spaces? But we can't live in our own little cocoons and come at forums like this, and then we talk shop, we go back, and we don't know what to do. We need to be on the same Last Supper table like everybody else to have our voices heard. What are the implications from the budgets that we receive, and why we need a central pot where all this can be discussed, and where do we see our university publishing houses coming into the fore? I just want to bring this forth to the fact that, colleagues, we are aware of our literacy rates. You saw the report the other day, our grade fours who can read, let alone understanding what they are reading. What does it say to us when we talk about scholarly publishing and scholarly communication and negating the languages? Because it's not just about English. All those kids can't even learn and understand their own mother tongue. And where do we put our resources? Because it's a value chain. When we start there and we say, for attrition and for us to be able to have all these researchers at the end of the day, where do they start to understand? The other challenge that we see, there is pressure in our universities, Prof. Ahmed, that postgrads need to publish. Do I want to be an academic? I'm forced to be an academic. It's no longer your thesis and dissertation. If it's a dissertation, please have 2 articles or 3 articles coming out. And some institutions are actually designing little journals so that they can publish in there, so that there is something there. So we need to interrogate all these things and say, what are they leading up to? But at the end of the day, it comes back to us and say, what are we doing and how do we codify all this within the system? And also, how do we ensure that scholarly communication, scholarly research, and scholarship in general for the Global South speak about what we want to see with the publishers, with civic society, and also with our smaller publishers who are publishing in our indigenous languages, and also on aspects that impact and affect us in the Global South and in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to hand over now to Dr. Savo. If you have any comments you would like to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. A few things. Well, I'll speak as a researcher and just unpack a few experiences and struggles with publishing and open access and all that. But before that, I just wanted to mention tomorrow I'm going to speak about Department of Higher Education Training and the lists of accredited journals. This has been mentioned by a few speakers before me, I'll unpack that in a lot of detail to show how exclusionary the South African system is, and how the lists basically force academics to exclude the African continent when they're considering where to publish, to exclude much of the Global South when considering where to publish, and to largely go and try and publish in Europe and United States. And they face various challenges and issues, including the editorial racism. And it was quite interesting that this morning I came across an article, very recent article, about a study on editorial racism in academic journals, and it was published in Nature. I didn't have access. I was asked by Nature to pay in order to get access. So tomorrow I'm not going to be able to speak about that because of the things that we're talking about here today. So I just wanted to mention that because this is real. This is something that we as researchers experience on a daily basis. A few mentioned mentions that I wanted to make here. Prof. Baba was talking about the exclusionary system, that science and publishing is a very exclusionary system. I wanted to add that from a perspective of a researcher, it's also an exploitative system. We as researchers, we are often asked to provide services for free. We are asked to do peer reviews. And I mean, I do it. I very often do it. But, lately I've been thinking whether I should be peer reviewing for journals and for platforms that I don't have access to. Why should I do that? Because I cannot read the papers in those journals. Should I be giving my free time and my service? So there's a lot of exploitation that the academic community globally is feeling. We also feel that our own institutions are not valuing that work that we're putting in. We are supposed to do that in our free time, and who has the free time? So a lot of things I need to think about. I also wanted to mention that I fully agree with the principles. I fully agree with the ideals and everything, but very often, and I fully agree with open access. If I can, I'll publish everything that I do in open access, but very often I simply have no choice. A few months ago, I wanted to publish a paper about South African higher education in a South African journal. And that journal requires paying of article processing charges. I was able to arrange that with my institution, but my colleague, my co-author, was not able to make arrangements at her institution because she's a research associate at that institution, and that institution wants her research output because they get funding then from the government, but doesn't pay for article processing charges for the research associates because she is not a full-time staff member. So we had to make a choice. Do we pay ourselves from our pocket for a publication, or do we look for other alternative options? And so we had to choose a journal, an international journal, and publish behind the paywall because we just simply cannot afford. And our institutions are not supporting us. Yet we often see webinars and statements about open access and all kinds of different things. So the infrastructures that are there want us to publish, and of course, publish and perish. Publish or perish is a huge danger globally to science, but our institutions want our research and very often don't provide support for us to be able to publish the research. I mean, I've been in situations very often where I have to ask colleagues in other institutions to download papers for me. I'm not sure whether this is illegal. I know that publishers are in the room possibly, but we have to do a lot in order to access. So there's a big issue in terms of whether the general public, whether the policymakers, whether the
Anybody?
outside
Sorry,
of
Dr. Sava, we lost you.
Apologies, I'm not sure what's
To
happening.
just end with, yeah, do you want to just end with one sentence? Because we are running short of time as always.
I just wanted to say that there's a huge danger and there are huge complexities in terms of the general public and policymakers not being able to access a lot of research that we do. But very often us researchers cannot access a lot of research that is published by our colleagues or even ourselves because it is behind paywalls. It is very important for us to talk about this. We have to fight back because we as universities and academics and researchers, we are producing all this work that very often sits behind the paywalls. I think we have to start making choices in terms of how far do we want to be exploited by these big commercial entities, and whether we need to stop doing what we are currently doing because it's not working, it's not helping science. Thank you.
A round of applause. Okay, colleagues, we have time for 3 questions. I see a question right here in the front. I see a hand far at the back, and do I see another hand? I would like to take the 3 questions in one go and then ask the panelists to respond. So we'll start with you, Ellen.
question, I'm going to suggest we have about an hour and a half for lunch. So I would like to request that we take some more time for questions. We had a variety of speakers. It has been an enriching and quite a lot that we can learn from this. Therefore, it is about the engagement. So I would please ask that we take some more questions.
Fabulous.
And
Thank
we
you.
can go a little bit over time.
Great. Thank you so much. Right. So there's a question far at the back. And then I was told I would see the questions online. And I'm not seeing those. Thanks. I can see the question. I'll ask it in a second. Yes.
All right, thank you. Thank you to the panel and my name is from Rhodes University. I would like to ask a question, but also make a couple of statements. From what I've heard today is that, first of all, what I pick up is that we have not, even as librarians, agreed to what we mean by open access and what is the level of open access that we're really aiming to achieve. We are being led by publishers in many ways to be happy with green or orange, etc. And I think as a group, we should not settle for anything less than diamond, as at least as a vision and what we're working towards. So in terms of the principles, that is something I would like to ask of the librarians at least, and as Daisy said about the scholarly communication, let us understand the process and let us have clear focus where we're heading. But I also wanted to talk about something else. Academics are hiding behind academic freedom in many ways. So the very system that we are trying to fight in terms of exploitation, etc., of our authors, are also the system that's being underpinned by something that academics call academic freedom, and there's no mandate. Without that mandate, I think we are still fairly lost. But the one question I would like to ask is, do we see potentially that the university presses come together and create a single outlet for our universities in South Africa? We know there are different ways of possibly considering this. I've seen what some of the university press has done. UNISA, famous, half their titles is now with Taylor and Francis. And also, as a last remark, we talk about predatory. I would just like to ask that we rethink the term, because I think the biggest predators are actually next door. Just because it's legal doesn't make it bad. Good. And I think we should consider quality above quantity. And where we have editors in journals, we also have to allow them the opportunity to receive recognition for the work they do as editors. With NRF rating, etc., we see the authors, we see other things, but editors are falling short in South Africa because there's no incentive for them to continue a very difficult position, and their own research often is neglected at expense of editing a journal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Other questions? I'd like to take a group of questions. If I could, yeah. So online there is a question. What would encourage greater inter-Africa collaboration? An African Research Council, a role equivalent to that performed by the European Research Council? Thank you so much for that question. And then if there is one other hand, I'm sorry, it's very difficult to see hands with the lights. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You know, as everyone was presenting there, I was shouting. You know, I was shouting, and unfortunately, no one had my head. I felt like I was saying, Amanda, away too. Because, and I was shouting Amanda when everybody was presenting. I was looking, I was thinking to myself, okay, they say they want open access. I mean, those are, I don't want to use the word sharks. They say they want open access. How do we manipulate this to make an income? All right, we are going to come with author processing charges. And as we come with author processing charges, how much do we make it? And I have seen a ridiculous amount of 63,000 of that a researcher needs to pay. Where do they get such money? Like Dr. Geoffrey was saying there. Now, it seems like we have made this the responsibility of our leadership. we want to be told, oh, okay, they say they are making transformative. Oh, yes, it's good. But now it feels like we don't have a voice. We are not being very, very, very vocal. But now I'm going to sound like a politician and say, away with APCs, away. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to the panel. Does anybody want to jump in with a particular answer to one of the questions? And online, there's one more question I'm going to take because it links into what the previous person just said. And that is there or should we be setting up an APC fund by, I think they mean the World Bank. Yeah, by the World Bank. So there's African Research Council was one idea. Funding APCs through the World Bank is another idea. Who would like to start? Ahmed. Wonderful. Thank you. And yeah.
I just wondered whether.
Yes, just speak. They'll switch it on.
I just wondered whether Geoffrey should have a go first.
Yes. All right, Geoffrey. They're putting you on the hot seat.
Yeah. Well, I think I would suggest the African Research Council idea you should forget, because largely it was a response to Dr. Sava's presentation. So I think there are other things that have come through. Can I have a go at some of the responders? May I, in the interests of an energetic discussion, please? Silence is acquiescence. So, can you hear me, by the way?
So yes.
Good. Well, can I talk about three things? About public goods, which Ahmed responded to, efficiency, which Malavika responded to, what I think offers pathologies, which no one has spoken about, and I will. Public goods are really important. Public goods are free at the point of use. They're things like a free education, if that exists, either at university or at school. They're things like public roads. They're things like an honest police force. They're the basis for most private goods, and the interface between the public and private is absolutely vital. Knowledge is a classic public good, and what is happening, the publishers are privatizing prematurely a public good, and it's a mistake, a serious error. No one should have to pay for it, apart from the state, which already does. So I think the public goods issue is something you really must think about. Secondly, efficiency. Efficiency depends on what you're trying to do. The publishers are extremely efficient at making money. Look at the profit levels, 20%, 20%, 48%. So they're very efficient in that way. But it's a different question. Are they then efficient at serving the needs of science? And I would say no. And I see no reason why public organizations should be any less efficient or more efficient than private organizations. Then the pathologies, there are two monstrous pathologies. Don't forget the incentives we have in these bibliometrics drive us to make publishing papers the only real criterion for academic advancement. The only real criterion. The consequence is we publish more than 3 million papers a year. How many of those papers would be published if we gave teaching some significance? And I think that the real problem is that research has become the enemy of teaching because it has driven academics only to produce papers. And many academics would never dream of producing a paper unless they had the incentive to do so. Why should they? They can teach and they do it very well. We've got rid of many of our best teachers because they're not appreciated. So I think we really have to be careful about the pathology in the system. And the other problem is, of course, that one of the most important issues for us, particularly in Africa, but it's a universal phenomenon. We need more researchers to be involved in the process of talking to our citizens. There must be a much stronger link between knowledge as we develop it within universities and knowledge as it's used in society. And those of us who are best equipped to take part in this business of translating knowledge into society are far too busy writing yet another paper, which no one will read. So we've got to create space in our universities. Firstly, for educating the next generation, and secondly, engaging with our fellow citizens. And all we do is sit down and write yet more papers, period. Or discuss, as they say.
There was a lot of enthusiastic applause for what you were saying. I'm not sure if you heard it.
Very sensible audience.
Yes, and a lot of online applause as well, as you can see. So I wonder if you want to respond.
Thank you so much. By the way, I mean, Geoffrey gets a lot of applause wherever he speaks. So, yeah, I just wanted to make one point because, you know, I'm a theoretical physicist, so I try to always look for kind of a convergence point, you know, where we can understand things from a grand unified theory, if you like. You know. So, the one thing that we have to sort of engage with is this idea that higher education, science, and so on have been captured by kind of the logic of globalization. You know, so everything is now commodified. You know, science is commodified, higher education is commodified, and it's that really drives, I mean, all of this enterprise, if you like. And I think that's why it's so critically important for us to return scholarly publishing into the hands of scholars. You know, the governance model has to place scholars at the center of that governance model, because it's really about reclaiming the public good of science. You know, reclaiming the space that science has always occupied, but which has been taken away from it. And by the way, you know, this scramble for publications at our universities is driven by the ranking system on the one hand. By the way, the ranking system is nothing more than an instrument of globalization. That is what it is. And we are all scrambling for, you know, for higher rankings. So that's the one side of it. The other side of it is that we are scrambling for money. You know, what the government does is put together a research output incentive system for institutions, and now universities are competing with each other for that. So it's those are all tied in together, and we have to reimagine, you know, this how to reestablish science as a public good, and scholarly publishing is right at the heart of that. Thank you.
Right, who next would like to?
It
Fantastic.
comes to me, I'll take
Wonderful.
it. Okay, I will try and answer a few things from quick thoughts that I had as I heard the questions. Somebody asked about should university presses come together, and I think there is an example of that in Scotland. There is a Scottish university presses all coming together, and that's an interesting case study. But alongside telling you about that, I will say, I don't know very much about it, but I will say it seemed to me when I first heard about it that really what the model that they are choosing to run those presses is the APC model, okay? Because that's what they saw to be the way that they could fund the infrastructure that was needed to run all of the university presses, and we just heard away from with APCs. So, you know, I will give you those two thoughts together. About more on away with APCs and about we should not settle for less than diamond. All I can say is stick around. I will delve into some of these topics in my talk in greater detail, so I don't want to repeat things, but some of this gets unpacked in my talk, hopefully to your satisfaction. If not, come find me and we talk some more. Then I will pick up very quickly on the African Research Council. Should we have one like that, just like the ERC? And I'm no expert in this area, but from a lot of work I'm doing for OASPA, studying the OA market, looking at equity, my caution would be, please don't necessarily say, that works in that region, it will work here, okay? That I've really found that that's not always helpful. Take what works for you, right? We have this concept in India called jugaad. Jugaad means, you take something, it wasn't built for this purpose, but you use it there. And it really, I was thinking about it as Adam did his presentation, right, with the we and things like that. That's a really good way to look at things. Take what you like from the ERC, fine, but look at how it needs to work in Africa, whether it needs to be one, whether it needs to be many, right? So that would be my response to that. And a couple of final thoughts. One is to say that rather than taking time here, I would like to point the audience, people online, people in the room, to a blog I've written for OASPA called "Why Do Professors Pick Paywalls?" Okay, because in that, if you Google "Why Do Professors Pick Paywalls?" OASPA, it should come up, because there I unpack a little bit more the payment problem and the prestige problem, and also something we haven't got the time, I think, to go into, where the payment and prestige problems overlap as well, okay? And finally, I think nothing changes at all if there is no reform of the career evaluation system. Okay, so we really have to think about what do we value, and then how do we make it in the natural workflow for our researchers, so we don't add friction and complexity in their natural workflows. How do we make it easy for them to do things that we want to value more, and that we make sure we reward them for those things, like open practices.
Awesome. Either of you? Yes, Andrew.
Thanks very much, everyone. I just wanted to thank you for all of you, the panelists, and for really, really great discussion. So many things kind of running through my head. But I think just one takeaway is just on the element of rankings and metrics, the pressure that puts on various parts of the scholarly communications network, various parts of it, publishers and researchers and managers of research. I think we need some clarity, perhaps, about what is valuable and what isn't, or maybe we need to make some decisions about what's valuable, what matters to us, what we're trying to do. Because at the moment, I'd say most publishers just chase every single ball that's thrown out into the park, like little Labradors. We just go after everything because one researcher says it's valuable and the other one says it's valuable, so we do both. And I think that clarity would be very, very good to have. The last thing I wanted to do was, I couldn't see the speaker, the question from the person out there about the single output for university presses. I mean, that obviously is something that's so relevant. If you don't mind, I don't want to be in like an episode of Succession, but I will try to address that in my discussion later, if I can, just to save time.
Lovely, thank you,
Thanks.
Andrew. Daisy,
I think I have no further comment.
All right, no further comments.
I think what's important is Geoffrey can actually explain more about the GRC, how they work. And I think I like the analogy that don't take what's out there with the ERC and think that you can have an African Research Council, because you also need to look at what you want to achieve and who's going to be the funder and where is it going to be hosted. Because as Africans, we don't want to be all playing Big Brother. And we know what's happening in Southern Africa with some elements where we are perceived as big brothers, because you want to embrace everything and everybody must absorb. So we have to be careful. It's a good idea, like it was fleshed years ago about the, what's that, I even wrote it, a college of reviewers, a college of editors and whatever. But how are you going to manage it, and where's the funding going to come from? Because if it comes from one country, then you have challenges. Thank you.
Dr. Savo, have you any comments you would like to add?
Yeah, early when I was speaking, the speaker before me highlighted something that is very important, and that is the lack of political will. And I just wanted to perhaps just end with that. I'm not sure how many people in the audience know that the African Union has the Continental Education Strategy for Africa. The document has been published, approved, and endorsed by all the members of the African Union, including the South African government, back in 2016. It's supposed to go up until 2025, so we're almost at the end of it. In my work over many years in South African higher education, I've struggled to find anybody who was aware of this continental education strategy that South Africa is part of. So, there are a lot of policy documents. There are a lot of policy documents in South Africa as well that, when I spoke earlier about international research collaboration, that speak, all the good things are there on paper, but then when it comes to implementation, when it comes to also support for the implementation, we don't see that happening. So, that links to the comments also about, who should be driving research or supporting research on the African continent. And, there's a lot of talk about, what needs to happen in that continental education strategy. There's talk about that African governments need to fund their own systems, in their own settings, in order for the continent to be able to do things that are important and necessary on the continent. Otherwise, you're going to get European Union funding, and we're going to play their game, and we're going to do what they have designed in their own settings and what works in their settings. So one of the speakers earlier said that there is so much that needs to happen and be driven from the continent, and not only just look at whatever is happening elsewhere. But currently, a lot of research by national systems, by institutions on the African continent are funded from the outside, driven by the outside, from the United States, from European Union, from China, from other places. And so basically, very often the continent and its institutions and its researchers get exploited and be treated just as, collectors of data. We need to fight against that as well. And I think there's a need to engage with policymakers and engage on the lack of political will.
Do I see any other burning questions? There is a comment online, if I could just bring that back up, around terminology. And there's a question over there. Okay, so this will, do you want to, just give me a second, let me just read this question. It's important to get the terminology correct. What do we mean by transformative and transformational agreements? We seem to be using these terms interchangeably. From Alfred from UWC. And then over to you for your question.
Good, I think it's afternoon now. Afternoon, colleagues, and thanks for the comment from the panelists. Some are thought-provoking to all of us being here as librarians. One of the panelists talked and said, what practical approach are we going to use going forward? So I'm thinking that now that we are here, when we go out, we must have some resolution to say, what is it that we are going to do as librarians? One of the panelists indicated that as librarians, what we are doing now, we were never taught about them. And when we look at the curriculum now of the librarian at the universities, what is it that they are doing? What is it that they are teaching the future librarian? Because that's why at the end of the day, we end up being the last person or the last people at the last supper or the upper room, because things are imposed to us because we don't have the background. If you look at what is happening now, most of the institutions, they are talking about research. And when things are tough, they come to us as librarians to say, assist us with the research. When the research articles are withdrawn, last week it was worse, most of the articles were withdrawn. And those articles already they've been published or cited. So us as the librarian, what is our role? Is our role just to train them or to make them aware that yes, you can publish in a authentic journal? What is the role, or why not publish in a predatory journal? I think we need also to make sure that we educate and empower ourselves on part of the research, because if we don't do that, it will come back to us to say, as a librarian, you need to make sure you follow what the research department are doing. The political parties in South Africa, when things are tough, they talk of coalition. what is the coalition that us we can form as the library? And when we look at our institution, we have capacity. We have staff that are working, but is our capacity relevant to what is happening now? Can we stand up and say what we are having is able to support the changes that are happening in the world and in the institution? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Does anybody want to answer in any particular way? No? Okay. Prof. Ahmed, I'm going to give you the last comment.
No, I think it's more like a comment, I think, to the meeting. So I think that's very useful, I think. I mean, on the issue of transformational or transformative, I don't know what I can't remember what the exact term was. I think it's transformative agreements.
Yes.
And I think the idea of them, I think we have to accept, that transformative agreements are really APCs based. We're not changing the business model. The question really was, is there a way of developing a model that would create open access? But it was always the idea that this would be additional pressure on the companies to change their business model. But clearly that's not happening. In fact, what they've done is taken this very interesting idea and consolidated that now into their business models.
Exactly.
So I think we have to move to a new model. I don't think there's any option for us there.
Right. Thank you very much. And as we move to a new model, I really hope the new model will be a space in which we actually recognize editors of journals in some kind of way, because we are the people that do the bulk of the work and get absolutely no reward for what we're doing. We don't get financial reward, we don't get academic rewards, we just do it for the sake of the academic community that we're a part of. So I think this has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you all so much for participating, and I look forward to hearing some of you speak later as we continue this conversation. Colleagues, can we give our panelists a round of applause?